Hello everyone, this is Mike. I'm going to walk you through the basics of how to create a Tableau web data connector. I'm going to walk through the tutorial that's in our documentation so that you can see what it looks like in action. Before I get started though, I want to talk a little bit about web-based data sources. For this tutorial we're going to use data that we get from Yahoo, but of course a web data connector can get data from anywhere. Let me show you what we're going to do. Yahoo has this language for making queries against the web. It looks a little bit like SQL, and here's an example of what you can do. You can create a statement that says select star from, and then you indicate the place where you want to get the data from, and you can give it all kinds of where clauses and stuff. In this case, what we're doing is we're going to give it a stock symbol, and data is the stock symbol for Tableau as a company, and we're going to look for a start date and an end date. So this is a YML query. You make this query by sending a request to Yahoo that looks a little bit like this. It's basically an HTTP query that you've embedded the YML query into, along with a little bit of additional information down here, for example, about where you're going to get the data and what format you want the return to be in. You just send this query to Yahoo. I'll actually bring up a browser window and I'll paste in that big old URL that contains the YML query that we're working with. And after a few seconds, you get back all this data from Yahoo, which in this case, because we requested it in JSON format, comes back as a big old JSON block. So this is an example of the kind of data that you can get across the web. And what we're going to do is we're going to build a web data connector to make queries like this and get back data from Yahoo. To spare you the agony of watching me do all this typing, I'm going to start off by pasting in the skeleton of a web data connector. This is basically what all web data connectors look like to begin with. They're HTML pages with some JavaScript. One of the most important things here is going to be that you have to reference the Tableau web data connector JS file, Tableau wdc110.js. That's our current version. We currently have that available on Tableau Public and on Tableau Online, or you can download it and embed it yourself. In this case, I'm going to also use jQuery library because I'm going to do some of the work with jQuery, but that's optional. So here's the basic outline of the JavaScript code that you have to provide. The first thing you do is you instantiate a connector by calling the Tableau object's makeConnector function. The Tableau object is something that's defined up in the Tableau wdc.js file. Then you're going to have two functions in all of your web data connectors. One of them is called getColumnHeaders, and one of them is called getTableData. I'll explain those in just a minute. When you're done defining at least those two functions, you're also going to have to register your connector by calling this registerConnector function of the Tableau object. And that finishes the initialization process. Okay, so right now, that's all we've got, but it's the basics of what pretty much every WDC is going to have. Per our scenario, what we're going to do is we're going to prompt the user to enter in a stock symbol. You saw in the example that I showed you a minute ago that we entered the stock symbol data, the stock symbol for Tableau, brought back a month's worth of stock prices for Tableau. So in order to prompt the user, I'm going to have to create a little bit of HTML here. Again, I'll just paste it in. It's very simple. There's just a text box and a button. And I'm going to have to paste in a little bit of code to actually handle the user's submit. In this case, there are two things that are particularly interesting. One is that I'm going to have to take the information that the user's entered, and I'm going to store it in a property of the Tableau object called connection data. Anything that the user types in that you're going to need later in the connector, you put into the connection data property. When you've completely finished processing the user's data, you call Tableau.submit. This tells Tableau that this phase of the connector is finished. Although we don't really have much going yet, we could test our connector so far just to see if it's working. The way to do that is to use the simulator that we include in the Web Data Connector SDK. This is optional. You can do all your testing in Tableau proper. But the simulator runs as a web page in the browser and therefore lets you take advantage of all the debugging capabilities that are built into your browser. In order to run the simulator, you have to request it from a web server. I don't have a big web server running on this computer, but I can use the development server that's built into Python. So I have a handy batch file here that will start it. Let me do that. And I'll show you what's happening here. the Python development server is running, and it's listing on port 8888 for localhost traffic. All right, I'll bring up a browser window, and then I'm going to paste in the URL of the simulator. So I'm going to load the simulator, and I'm going to pass to the simulator the name of the web data connector that I'm currently developing. So here we go. And there it is. Not very fancy. I just have a text box and a button, like you saw earlier. I can type in some data. Nothing's really going to happen, except there is one interesting thing that you can see here. One is that the Tableau.connection name and Tableau.connection data values are being reflected in the simulator. This tells me that the code that's responding to the button click is working and it's interacting properly with the Tableau object. So I'm going to leave this open because we're going to come back to it in just a minute. All right. All the work we've done so far has been to implement what we call the UI phase of the Web Data Connector. Web Data Connectors are called by Tableau twice. In the first phase, or the UI phase, they present a UI to the user so that the user can fill in any parameter values that you're going to need later in order to make your queries to your data source. Once the UI phase is finished, which is to say once you've called Tableau.submit, Tableau calls your Web Data Connector a second time. We call that the data gathering phase, and that's where all the fun stuff happens. So let's get that implemented. The first thing that Tableau is going to do is it's going to want to know what the schema is for the data that you're returning to it. And to do that, it calls the getColumnHeaders function in your code. Right now, that's just a skeleton that we pasted in earlier. Let me paste in the code that we'll need to make this work with the Yahoo data source. Okay, so I'm going to overwrite the skeleton code, and I've added in the final code, which is actually very simple. It basically consists of two arrays. There's an array of field names or column names, and then there's a corresponding array of data types. So here you can see that the ticker column is a string and the date column is a date and so forth. When I've got my two arrays, then what I do is I call Tableau.headers callback, which is a function on the Tableau object, and I pass those two arrays back to Tableau. So now Tableau knows what kinds of columns and data types to expect from my data. Once Tableau has the schema for the data that you're going to return, then it calls the getTableData function. The getTableData function is really the heart of your Web Data Connector. That's what Tableau is going to call to basically say, go get the data from your data source and bring it back to me. So let me paste in some code for that. And I'm going to emphasize again that however your data source provides you with data, this is where you're going to do all that work. In our case, to remind you, what we're going to do is we're going to make a call out to Yahoo using that kind of YML query that I was showing you earlier. We're going to get back a bunch of JSON data. We're going to parse through that JSON data, format it properly, and send it to Tableau. So let me walk you through that very quickly. We're going to send back an array to Tableau. When we're all done, no matter how we got our data or what we had to do to get it, we're going to create an array, and we're going to return the array to Tableau. The value that the user entered, remember we presented a UI to the user and allowed the user to enter in a stock ticker symbol. We put that at the time into the Tableau's object's connection data property. This is how we get it back out again. And this is important to understand. The two phases, the UI phase and the data gathering phase, happen in completely different browser sessions. So there's no other way to share data between those phases. You can't put it in a global variable or you can't stick it in a cookie. That's why we have the connection data property. You can put string data into connection data in the UI phase and then get it back out in the data gathering phase. So the user gave us a stock symbol, and we put it in connection data. Then basically what we're going to do is we're going to create a bunch of parameters. We've got the stock symbol, and we want a starting date and an ending date, which for the purposes of this demo, we're just calculating as today less 1 year. And then we're going to build that complex URI that we have to send to Yahoo in order to implement or in order to execute the YML query. To save us a little bit of trouble, we're going to do that using a helper method, which I'll paste in a little bit. But the basic idea is that we're going to create this big old URI. Then we're going to use a little bit of jQuery to actually make the request to Yahoo. And this is standard jQuery, in case you're not already familiar with it. You pass it, you call it AJAX function, you pass it the URL you want to talk to, and you tell it what kind of data you want to get back. In this case, we want to get back JSON data. Fair enough. When that function returns, it calls this function that we define in the success parameter, and then for each value that Yahoo returns to us in the JSON, we're going to create a JavaScript object with name value pairs for the ticker and the day and the close. As you can see here, I should probably point out that the ticker and the day and the close values that you indicate here should match the schema that you defined earlier in the get column headers function. All right. For each, as I said, for each JSON record, we're going to create a JavaScript object, and we're going to add it to the array that we defined at the beginning of this function, the data to, and we're going to add it to the data to return array that we defined at the beginning of the function. When we've parsed all the way through all the JSON, we're going to finally return this information to Tableau by calling the Tableau object's data callback function. That function expects just an array of JSON objects, which we've built up out of the JSON. And then if you want to implement paging because you only get back chunks of data from your data source or whatever, you can also use these additional parameters here, last record token and false. We don't have to worry about those because all the data that we need for this web data connector we're getting back in one call. And that's actually pretty much it. What we're going to do, to reiterate, is we're going to make a call out to Yahoo. We're going to get back a chunk of JSON, and then we're going to parse through it. For every JSON record, we create a corresponding object in our code and add it to an array, send that back to Tableau. The only thing that really left for me to do at this point is to add the helper functions that I alluded to earlier to build the URI. Let me do that right now. I don't really want to go through this code in great detail because every implementation of a web data connector is going to be a little bit different in what it needs to do here. But here we have this build URI function, which is our helper function for creating the Yahoo URL. And you can see that there's a query statement, and it basically builds it up using the parameters that we send to it. And then there's a couple of two-liners or three-liners for formatting the dates in the format that Yahoo wants. And that's pretty much it. We've got our web data connector all finished, I believe. Let's go back and test it in the simulator again. So what I need to do is go back to that simulator. Here it is. I'm going to reload it. I'm going to enter in that same data stock ticker symbol. Click get the data. So this time, not only do I fill in these values for connection name and connection data, but I actually get back the data. And here it is. This is the data that's been returned from Yahoo, and then it shows the results of that parsing operation and adding everything to the array. So it seems to be working. What we really want to do, of course, is we want to show all of this working in Tableau proper. To use a web data connector in Tableau, you choose More Servers, and then you choose Web Data Connector. You enter in the address of your web data connector. In this case, it's going to be localhost because I'm still using that Python development server. Okay, there we go. The web data connector is running its UI phase inside of Tableau. I'll enter in that same stock ticker that we've been playing with. I'll get the data. There'll be a second while it actually makes the query out to Yahoo before it comes back. And here we go. And just to show you how you might use this for analysis, I'll use some of the values that we got back from Yahoo. I'm going to change this to days because we're really interested in days. And we don't actually want the sum of the prices. I think we probably want the average of them. And there we go. We've used the web data connector to go to Yahoo, get stock values for a certain period, and then we can analyze them in Tableau. And that's pretty much it. The details of how you go and get your data out of a web data connector are going to vary according to the data source, but the basic outline of how you create a web data source is exactly what you saw here. It's pretty amazing.